Hello, my name is Eric Patterson, and this is the Religious Freedom Institute's 3 Questions on Ukraine interview series. At the Religious Freedom Institute, we work to secure religious freedom for everyone, everywhere around the world. The purpose of the 3 Questions on Ukraine interview series, in the context of the ongoing conflict there, is to increase understanding of the religious dynamics of the region and the many dimensions of religious freedom in Ukraine. My guest today is Archpriest Alexander F.C. Webster, Father Alexander, Dean and Professor of Moral Theology Emeritus. He spent 38 years as a pastor, a professor, and a military chaplain, and he retired from the U.S. Army with the rank of colonel after 24 years of service. Thank you for your service, Father Webster, and for joining us today.
Well, you're most welcome, and I'm delighted to be here.
So let me ask you right off the bat, what is the fundamental moral or ethical issue at stake in this conflict in Ukraine?
I have to take a little time to ground this in what I call the Orthodox justifiable war tradition. And it's not identical with what we know as the just war theory. And I like to use the word justifiable as an homage to the great Paul Ramsey, professor at Princeton for so many decades, who wrote War and the Christian Conscience, which I think is one of the greatest books of the 20th century. He also wrote a book on just war. And so his term justifiable, I think, is a proper nuance. So let me begin by saying that there are 3 criteria that I've been able to deduce from studying history, theology, church, lives of the saints, even liturgical traditions in the Orthodox tradition, spiritual writings, canon law, all these components which form the tradition, that which is passed on down. Of course, scripture being the pinnacle of all of it. And the first one is what I call a proper political ethos. And that means that an empire, because this tradition was formed during the era of the Roman Empire after it became Christian. But whether it's an empire, a government, the military and society, are they worthy of defense through the violence of war? In other words, does the government, the political structure, the society, does it warrant the use of Orthodox Christians in that society, in that government, in that nation, empire, using lethal violence? The second thing is what I call the defense of the people of God. And again, this focuses on the Orthodox Church. I'm giving not a secular or global or even a political analysis. This is a theological analysis, moral theological. So I'm grounded heavily in the tradition. And the people of God defined here as the church. Defense against an unjust aggressor as a moral duty. If an aggressor, whoever it may be, whatever it may be, is attacking your country, your nation, you have an obligation as an Orthodox Christian, if the people of God have been given the freedom to worship, perhaps even to form the government or to influence the government. The third criterion is what I call righteous spiritual intent. And that's the pursuit of genuine justice for all. It's not just for your own nation, your own empire. There's got to be, and this is where the Christian flavor really is, it blossoms here. Justice for all, even ultimately rehabilitation and forgiveness of the enemy. And during the period of hostilities, analogous to the Western just war theory in terms of jus in bello, the criteria for conducting war properly, justly, that entails righteous and positive discrimination in favor of the immunity of non-combatants from direct attack and proportionality of the violence to the cause. So it sounds very much like the Western just war theory, but the focus here is religious. And that's what I want to stress. When I speak about the current war in Ukraine, launched by President Putin of the Russian Federation, my bottom line is this: I denounce it. It's morally unjustifiable because it doesn't pass the second and third of those criteria. Now, the first one, it does suffice, because since the fall of the Soviet Union, 1991, something I never thought I'd live to see, the government has gradually warmed up again to the church. Remember, the Russian Orthodox Church was not the state religion, but it was certainly favored and had very close ties with the Tsars. But since then, there's been a flowering of freedom for the Russian Orthodox Church, and not all, but most other religions in the vast Russian continental territory. There's some, I regret that, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons are discriminated against, and I've been fighting against that for decades. But the church is flowering. Putin himself, I think, is a genuine believer, despite what people think about him as a madman or a maniac or an evil demon. A lot of that is cartoonish, but he is genuinely a believer, and he's been supporting the church better even than sometimes the Tsars. So that criteria is met, but the other two are woefully lacking. And what do I mean? If Putin's incursion into Ukraine had been strictly to protect the Donbass, those two provinces, Donetsk and Lugansk in southeastern Ukraine, which have been under fire for 8 years now, after the revolution that overturned the Ukrainian government that was favorable toward Russia, and then put in Poroshenko, who is a brute and sort of a, I think descriptions of him are the ones that we ought to apply instead of to Putin. Although Putin has sort of ruined his reputation with any of us in what he's doing now. But the people in the Donbass, Russians, predominantly Russians, I think 80–90%, have been subject to systematic discrimination, persecution, and murders, mass violence for 8 years. If he had simply gone in to secure those areas and then, quote, liberate them from Ukraine, I would have supported that. If the means he used were in accordance with principle number 3, which is proportionality and also non-combatant immunity from direct attack. But he didn't do that. He's trying to invade the entire country, at least the eastern part of Ukraine. I don't think there's any intent on his part for the Russian Federation to occupy all of Ukraine. That's a foolhardy enterprise. It'd be guerrilla warfare for years if he tried to do that. I think he's trying to remove an existential threat, as he sees it, posed by the current Ukraine situation. We'll come to that in a moment. But I want to just wrap up this initial comment in terms of the unjustifiable quality of this invasion. We've also seen, at least reports are, I think, overwhelming. There's some of it's got to be true. A lot of the media, of course, I think are warmongering for some reason in America. I don't understand it. But there has been indiscriminate shelling of non-combatant civilian targets. Now, some of that may be collateral damage, accidental weapons. I don't believe that suffices to explain this. There's too much of this going on. So he's failing miserably, Putin and the Russians, in terms of the conduct of this war. And I like to compare this in terms of Orthodox tradition, history, to what I regard heretofore as the most stupid and unjustifiable war ever conducted by Orthodox nations. And that was in 1885, when the newly liberated from Ottoman Turkish oppression Serbian and Bulgarian kingdoms, they had kings again, Orthodox kings as they had in the Middle Ages. They went to war over a province called Eastern Rumelia, which was really not of much value. But the spectacle of two of these newly reformed Orthodox kingdoms going to hostilities with vicious violence over land that was almost worthless. It doesn't matter what the land, but they were killing each other. This is like the nadir of unjustifiable war. And I see the comparison now very vividly between Russia and Ukraine. what most people in the West may not know is that Ukraine is predominantly Eastern Orthodox. In fact, the largest church in terms of its numbers of congregations is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is an autonomous branch of the Russian Orthodox Church headquartered in Moscow. So we have the spectacle once again on a much grander, horrible scale compared to 1885 in the Balkans of Russia and Ukraine engaging in combat, both of them predominantly, historically, and currently Orthodox nations.
Father Alexander, I want to just pick up on something that you've mentioned in your writings and that you're alluding to here, and that is you've in the past said that almost no conflict is just good guys versus entirely bad guys. Could you say a little bit more about that in this conflict?
Again, despite the overwhelming depictions of this war and all the media I'm watching all the networks, including Fox News, I think they're really guilty of warmongering and very selective reporting. There is also an incredible animus against all things Russian. We've seen this on and off. During the Soviet era, the left was very much cozy with the Soviet Union, but now we have left and right and people of otherwise judicious temperament getting on this bandwagon. Now, there's some broadcast journalists, I think, for example, Tucker Carlson, has been trying to maintain a very even-handed approach to this topic. And there are also some very prominent figures in society. I think, for example, the Professor John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago, who I think is one of the great political theorists. He's been offering a very, I think, profoundly different a take on this, not to justify the violence and the war, but to emphasize the problem of Ukraine and NATO engaging in provocative actions. The same thing with Colonel Douglas McGregor. I see him a lot on Fox News analyzing the situation. When I say there are no good guys and bad guys in this conflict, let's just take it for example, as a given that Putin himself and the Russian Federation are behaving poorly here. They are not good guys in this conflict, but neither is the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government, especially since 2014, with the Maidan, the violence of the Maidan, the overthrow of the government, it was an illegitimate overthrow, a coup d'etat of the governing authority. The launching of right sector neo-Nazi forces, for example, the Azov battalion. Most people don't know about that. These are clearly neo-Nazis, especially toward the area of the Donbass. The horrible things that have been happening there, that's not a justifiable government worthy of defense either. And you also have the corruption and the tendency of Ukraine now to mimic the worst of Western society with what we call the woke ideology. You don't see that in Russia. Now, Russia may be repressive in many ways, but one of the things that at least they're doing there is to protect their children from what we call here woke ideology, from sexual practices that are anathema to the Bible and to Christian tradition, to discrimination on the basis of race or color and so on. So that government in Ukraine are not the good guys either. Now, they're being victimized by the Russians. I don't want to misspeak on that. And you wonder whether some of the news reports of the Ukrainian activity in this war are correct. It's the few that leak through, and that is that there may be an attempt by some of these factors, the Azov battalion, for example, to use Ukrainian civilians as a pawn in this conflict. Another thing we see is that Zelensky, who's been hailed for requiring all the men of proper age to stay in the country, not flee the country with their families or just flee on their own in order to serve in the military. Now, what that does, ironically, is to make all of those conscripts combatants. They're no longer civilians. And it's that by order of the government, which I think is a tyrannical thing, forcing people, men, to serve, no matter what their consciences tell them, separating them from their families. So the idea that they are combatants, which means if they are killed in the course of the war, that's not a violation of non-combatant immunity. So in a way, they've set themselves up for some second guessing after this whole thing is over. God willing, it will be soon. So those are the main reasons why I think the portrayal of this conflict as good guys and bad guys, black hats and white hats, is just preposterous. It's and it really grieves me. Again, we have two historically Orthodox nations, predominantly Orthodox, engaging in this despicable war.
That really helps, and it ties to something that one of our earlier interviews with Mark Tooley of the Institute on Religion and Democracy talked about. And one of the things he talked about was about praying, about people of faith praying for both sides, praying for the families, praying for the young people, praying for the leaders, but recognizing that one of the things that can happen in war is that hatred and bitterness can raise up in a new generation on both sides during the conflict and after the conflict. And that's one of these areas about intention and the matters of the heart that you're talking about that needs to be guarded against and can be an area for prayer. And
there's one more thing, if I may. I'd like to add this. We're hearing this a lot in certain circles, but I like to make a point of it as well. The allegation, and I think it's reasonable, that this is the largest land war in Europe since World War II. But there was one back in 1995 and 1997 that's often overlooked. And that is 1998. And that was the war of NATO. NATO involved in military activities, airstrikes on Serbia over the Kosovo crisis. Kosovo had been a province of Serbia since going back to the Middle Ages, the 13th century Serbian state. Even under Tito, Kosovo was sort of, Tito, the communist leader, after World War II, Kosovo had been given sort of an autonomous status, but it was still historically Serbian. Some of the greatest and most venerable sites, churches, monasteries of the Serbian Orthodox Church are in Kosovo. And Kosovo had become, over the years, predominantly Albanian Muslim, whereas Serbia was an Orthodox country. The prospect, I remember watching this and was horrified by this. NATO, including US aircraft, bombing bridges, the cities, troop elements. It was taking out the infrastructure can be considered military. It can also be considered disproportional. And there's one thing that stands out more than anything else. It was a photograph of a British bomber with the men loading the bombs into the plane. And one of them had written, "Happy Easter, Serbs." That is a specifically religious reference. The idea of attacking them during our Easter, which is usually later than the Western Easter, for reasons I won't get into, that showed there was a religious animus then. So NATO does not have clean hands itself in recent decades.
So this brings up, and you've been a keen observer of these things, not just from your perch as a churchman and as a theologian and as a university professor, but of course, more than 2 decades as an Army chaplain, watching these things deploying, et cetera. And so I wanted to bring you to the third and last question, that is, help us understand if the Russian people have an understanding that there's a legitimate grievance here that would motivate this war. Does the Russian Federation, does President Putin have any, is there some sort of point of view that Americans are missing, that Western audiences are missing? You've referred to the media being quite selective. That's being caricatured and that we should have a better understanding of.
I'm not sure it's being caricatured is what I'm about to say, but it certainly has been taken for granted that Ukraine and NATO are perfect together and ought to be together. The way I like, the way that Professor Mearsheimer recently in a video like this described it as the prospect of Ukraine, which again is the heartland of both the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. It began in the 10th century as Kievan Rus. Rus, the name became later the name for the Russian nation, Russian state. But this heartland is a sacred place. It has been part of the Russian Empire, unquestionably, since the 17th century. And before that, Ukraine was never an identifiable nation, really, and technically, until 1918. Under Lenin, he began separating the country into socialist republics. So that was a few years later, but that was on the track for that. So this is sacred land for both the Russians and Ukrainians. And if you look at the map, Ukraine is really the entire southwestern portion of what was once the Russian Empire. It had been under Polish domination, Lithuanian, Polish-Lithuanian, Mongol, but it has been identified as the cradle of Russian civilization for centuries. The prospect of Ukraine under a new, independent, secular government being part of the NATO alliance is an existential threat to the Russians. That's how they see it. And I note that, for example, there are two ways of nations being connected with NATO. There's member nations, there's also partner. Of course, the member nations include 30 of them, United States. But Ukraine has been a partner nation of NATO dating back, I think, to the 1990s. But since 2014, that fatal year of the crisis in the Donbass and the overthrow of the Ukrainian government, the cooperation between NATO and Ukraine has been profound and increasing. NATO has helped to train, fund, and reform Ukraine's armed forces and defense institutions. NATO and Ukraine have conducted military exercises together. They share information on sensitive military and international issues such as cyber defense, logistics, countering hybrid warfare. So when President Zelensky keeps pleading and pleading and pleading for NATO to include Ukraine, and then when Zelensky at the same time and on February 19th announces that he intends to make Ukraine a nuclear power in violation of the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assistance in 1994, Russia faces an existential threat that would have justified some kind of action. And I think maybe if Putin had simply settled for the Donbass, that would have been a shot across the bow. Maybe that would have deterred this NATO expansion to include Ukraine. Maybe not. Maybe it would have spurred NATO to adopt Ukraine right away. But in any event, that's what the West is pushing for. full membership of Ukraine in NATO. And that is definitely unthinkable to the Russian Federation. And I think most Russians, whether they are supporters of Putin or not, would probably find that threatening as well. So again, I'm not justifying Putin's attempt to occupy much of Ukraine through violent means. But he certainly had reasons to suspect the intentions of Ukraine because of the Donbass, because of this increasing cozying up to NATO, possible nuclear weapons, God forbid, in Ukraine, and just the general animus that Ukrainians now, if more than ever, and some justifiable, feel toward Russians. This is, again, a spectacle that I hoped I would never see between two historic Orthodox nations, one of whom has nuclear weapons and can threaten the world.
Well, Father Alexander, this has been fascinating. Just as I've seen you in briefings before and read your material, it's well thought out. There's a lot of pieces there, and you help us to understand a broader context of what's going on the ground. And your framing helps us with thinking about legitimate political authorities. I'm using language I'm a little bit more familiar with, but authorities making decisions with right intentions and ones that protect civilians and things. You've helped us have some intellectual framing for thinking about some of the conditions of this conflict and the post-conflict as well. So I just want to say on behalf of all of us here at the Religious Freedom Institute, thank you very much.
Most welcome, and I thank you for this wonderful opportunity.